So I'm not going to introduce Simon for the roundtable. I'm going to introduce our next, one of our distinguished panelists. So distinguished panelist is a well-known free software developer and a former 3-time Debian project leader. He's currently a researcher in applied formal methods at Ariel, an associate professor of computer science at University Paris Diderot. He's also a board member of the Open Source Initiative, and he's also the recipient of the O'Reilly Open Source Award in 2015. Please welcome Stefano Zacchiroli. And our third panelist is, he's a British national. There he is. He's a British national based in France. He enjoys being at the boundary between business and technology, so he mixes the skills. And with 12 years in the telecommunication industry and extensive international exposure, he is currently head of open source governance at Orange. Please welcome Christian Patterson. So I'm going to sit with them and try to see what they have to tell us about open source governance. And I'm not going to start with Simon, who's just had the floor for half an hour. I will leave some time for questions from the audience. And we'll start first with the other panelists. We've just had 2 keynote presentations, one virtual, one real. And actually, from your perspective, Christian, any feedback, any comment on those presentations? Well, as you can tell, not everything was prepared.
A surprise question. I think it's of great interest to me, the vision that has been presented around the aspects of community. I think open source is really important, not because of the economic benefits or efficiencies that can be driven from open source, but through the innovations that can be created by bringing people together. So I very much appreciate the discourse that is more focused on thinking of the community and how the community can bring people together to drive that innovation, rather than thinking of the legal aspects to control risk. Obviously, we have to control risk and the legal side. That's an evidence. But using open source as a fundamental to sharing and discussion, for me, that's really where the benefits of open source lie.
Okay. Stefano, your comment.
Yeah, so I was telling Simon that he managed to stole most of my comments, so I guess it shows that we came from a very similar organization or the same organization. But so I want to highlight something which Simon mentioned in passing, but I think it's very important. It's about the possibility of gaming the system. So I very much agree that one of the key functions of a foundation is actually being an asset lock. But there's a very specific asset, which is copyright, which is very important because it has the potential of subverting the basic governance of your project and basically subverting the constitution of your project, as Simon said, quoting Ben Moglen. So basically, if you need to be very careful in the governance of your project, if you allow someone to have some sort of mandatory copyright assignment agreement or copyright license agreement required to be able to participate and contribute to your project. If you do allow that to any party, even if it is a foundation, you're basically changing the playing field, which is no longer balanced. So it is not necessarily bad to have copyright assignment agreements or CLA to a specific foundation or a specific nonprofit, for instance, but it pushes the barrier for the kind of requirements you have on the transparency, on how the organization is run, much higher. So this is a very important point to pay attention to, because it has the potential of undermining everything else, even if you have everything else that Simon said as very useful requirements for organizations.
Simon, you don't have a comment on your own presentation, do you?
I quite enjoyed it.
Oh, good. That was good presentation, indeed. Yes, quite good. Thank you. Actually, we have 2 perspectives here. We have the perspective of the user. I know Orange is a big user and also a strong contributor, but I would see you, Christian, here more from the user perspective. I assume that as head of open source governance at Orange, you deal more from the user perspective and how a big organization can integrate open source into its own information systems or its own assets of technology. Is that right?
For sure. I think Orange has traditionally been viewed as more a consumer of open source, but that's changing, that's progressively changing, and we're progressively now participating in an active fashion to a number of different initiatives, such as OPNFV, for example. So I think a lot of telecommunication companies would be in the same position as of Orange, as traditionally starting out as users of open source, and are now starting to see the benefits where open source is playing a more increasingly significant role in the fundamentals of today's communication. For example, network management and orchestration, or cloud infrastructures, for example. So governance from an Orange perspective has been more focused on usage, but is increasingly focused on participation and community building.
Okay, which is a good example of consumer becoming more and more contributor. But it seems to me that Simon and Stefano were defending more the perspective of the technology provider. So you're a developer. As a developer, you organize yourself as a one individual into a foundation or a multi-people foundation or a community or loosely coupled group of developers. And then you have to find your own governance, because it's not, you have to project something to the rest of the market and be able to communicate with the rest, with those that are not in your team. And from my perspective, governance is what makes you predictable, what help people contribute and join you. What do you think of this? What's your perspective on this?
The first thing I'd say is that actually user is the most important role in open source. No one joins an open source project to develop it. Almost everybody who joins an open source project joins it because they use it. And they may use it, it may be that it's a component technology and they are a developer who uses that component technology in their work. It may be that their employer has created this technology that they use in their business and has now made it open source. But it's desperately rare for somebody to join a project simply because they want to develop it. They almost always start as a user. And that's why user rights are actually your first priority, is to make sure that and that's where software freedom is so important, because the very first freedom is the freedom to use the software for any purpose. I think that a community actually builds itself pretty easily once you have got a group of users who want to co-develop together, because you'll find that they're either coming from a particular context. So maybe they're coming from a GNU project. They'll come with an expectation of the GPL, or they'll come from an Apache project with an expectation of the Apache license. They'll also fairly easily understand how they are going to maintain their independence from each other as they collaborate. And that will also be an anchor for the governance. So I actually don't think it's as hard as you think it is to create governance. I don't think you create governance for developers. I think you create governance for users who end up as co-developers. And this is exactly where Orange, I could have predicted what was going to happen with Orange. They're using lots of open source. Sooner or later, they start developing internally. And they discover that having created forks of all these projects, their effort in maintaining their code is too great. They wise up to the fact that contributing back reduces their development costs, and they overcome the legal burden with all their legal counsel telling them not to contribute because it's so dangerous. And they start contributing, and they become members of the community because they were users first. And I think that's what always happens.
But from the Debian perspective, Stefano, can you just give us a couple of highlights of on governance of this? I mean, it's a great project, obviously.
Sure. So first of all, I certainly agree that basically what they said is that using is a gateway drug to developing free software, and that's absolutely true. So in my experience from Debian, but more generally with all large free software projects, I would say that governance is actually a very important marketing point of your project. So I would say that we are past a very naive use of open source. So people no longer use open source only believing that it's free, so it's going to be cheap for me, more cheap than using proprietary software. That was a presentation of one of the benefits of free software, which was acceptable like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, but we are no longer there, hopefully. And so what's important for me is that all kind of large users of free software usually know that to be able to rely on some specific software, they should be able to influence where the software is going. So they should be able, if they want to, not they are obliged to, but if they want to, they should be able to have an impact on the technical choices that are made in the project via their own contributions. So I think these days, if you see a software project you are depending on as someone which is tightly controlled by a very specific entity, which have potentially commercial interests which are opposed to yours, you are maybe having less of a reason for choosing that product in opposition to other products. On the other hand, if you believe that you can put some engineering time on that project and affect the direction where that project is going, following the governance rule which hopefully put everyone on the same level, then you have extra reason for choosing that product over a competing product. So in that reason, I think from the point of view of user, it is an important key decision point, whether there is some fair governance, whatever that means, in a given project, which is both actual and perceived. And if you are a software producer, you have an interest in giving everyone the actual feeling that you do have fair governance that allows everyone to contribute to your project. I think that's one of the very appreciated points about Debian project, but more generally about all free software projects out there with good and perceivedly good governance.
Christina?
I agree with the comments that are coming out. I think one of the interests from industry, or one of the challenges for open source towards industry, is putting in place that governance, but not putting it in place purely from a point of transparency today, but also to allow a certain visibility on what's coming up in the future, to allow the participants to join into the direction of the roadmap, which is an interesting balance, because if an open source project has been initiated by a company for whatever reason, how does the direction of the community then take the project, but does it still answer to what the original demands on that project were, the original creating drivers for the project? So that's an interesting balance. But the other side is, obviously, projects coming along and saying, yes, but can we trust the roadmap of the project? Will it still be here tomorrow? Or will it change direction? Of course, there are answers for open source there, where we say, well, it's open source, so anyone can take a fork. But it's still a legitimate question. And I see too many open source projects today which don't yet have a visibility for what the roadmap is in the future. And I think that's still a break.
Simon, you urged us not to create new foundations, and then you ended up giving us the recipes to create acceptable new foundations.
That's because people inevitably do what's bad for them.
Oh, how sad.
There's an inverse psychology. You tell not to do that, so people will want to do that.
Yeah, people, just saying it's bad will immediately make people rush to go and do it. So you have to give instructions.
Eat less cookies, but here's a recipe if you want to eat some.
Yeah, here's a recipe for sugar-free cookies. Yeah.
Fine. Then, having given us the recipe, you did start with the idea of the license being paramount and being the starting point after software freedom. Fine. But I understand from what you've been saying that governance is not just about license, but it's, and I would personally define governance and the way we try to apply it to OW2 as like a social construct, a set of rules and how decisions are made, who are the roles, what are the organizations. You did mention the separations of powers, etc. So in your view, what, after licenses and software freedom, what would be the single most important element or component of a governance systems that you would like to see, or that would concur to a successful, acceptable governance system?
Okay. I'll just emphasize that I still believe that the license is key, because everything else you do is transient. But the license is the only way that you're allowed to use the copyright forever. So when the rules change, the only thing that doesn't change is the freedoms you've been given under the license. Now, having said that,
we know the license defines the rules of the game and what you can do with the software. Yeah.
Having said that,
behind that, you need a little bit more support behind the license to make the whole community live. And that's where another layer of governance.
So the next most important thing, I think, is making sure that your governance is representative of your contributors. So a great mode of failure for, and I won't tell you which open source project it is, but there's an open source project.
Oh, please.
No, you'll have to work it out. There's an open source project that makes sure that its official members never lose that official member status, and can always vote down novelties that come up with their successors. And that organization desperately needs to have limited membership so that you're only a member while you're contributing. And the reason for that is because it's the most important aspect of an open source community is to have its leadership elected by its current contributors.
Okay, so governance being representative.
Representativeness of contributors in the community. That would be. Christian, what single component of governance would you pick up? The same one, or could you highlight another one?
I think the same one, although you're coming from governance as from a viewpoint of provider. Obviously, I think Orange, as you've already mentioned, that also has the viewpoint of the user. So it's representative. We have a governance which is in place, which is as close as it can be to the developers who use the applications or solutions. I think one of the key components, which is across the board, is good communication, making sure, and I think this was brought out in your slides as well, making sure that what you've decided and communicated is clearly visible to everyone, including the reasoning behind and the chain of events leading up to that communication.
Being transparent and open.
Being transparent and promoting the use and the policies around the open source. So communication.
Okay, Stefano, you're coming third. I know it's
Right.
more and more difficult.
Indeed.
So what governance best practice you would single out?
So I would have said, but someone used a better expression. So the way I put it was having technical people in charge of technical decisions. But I think separation of power is actually a more clear way of framing that. And so basically I see governance as a two-level thing. So basically you have technical governance and you have political governance. So technical governance is who decide which lines of code get accepted and which are not. And also how do you solve conflicts. So at some point you will have in a large enough technical community people that get in conflicts because they want the project to go in opposite and incompatible directions. And you need ways to arbitrate who is right and who is wrong. Can be a benevolent dictator, can be other ways, but you need a way to arbitrate those conflicts. And political governance is a kind of a meta level, or if you want, a higher level on top of that. It's just basically stuff like who decides, so who decides who's in charge of technical decisions. And the two must be kind of separate as more as you can. And you need accountability, which is basically, I think, what you just said. So when there are technical decisions, you might find people that don't like it. Okay, that's fine. But you need to have accountability on how that decision has been reached. And the accountability should be something that is felt by the community, first of all by contributors, and also by potential users. Because if you don't have that, you immediately start thinking about, has this technical decision been rigged in some way? Has there been some political maneuvering to get into that specific situation? And that will inevitably push away potential contributors and even potential users.
So we claim at OW2 that a repository, having an open source license, and being on an open source repository, one of those I will not mention, is not enough for being an open source project. We claim that a real open source project has to be complemented by governance, and you've just proven that it's more than just the open source license, so thank you for that. Because all this panel is about governance and to help us be a better foundation, you understand that. Okay, we're picking your brain. Is governance, it's one thing that the tools you use determines what you do, or the game, the rules determine the game, or how you game the rules. We also have this idea that the infrastructure, the technical platform also helps determine the kind of social structure or the social organization that goes along. And the questions we're wondering is, how can we embed the governance into the infrastructure, or is the infrastructure a constraint on this type of governance you have, or can you automate governance? Can we have something that can be, I mean, we are stretching resources, but if we had a tool or a website, something with lots of automation and governance could be fully automated and all the project could be taken from incubation to mature automatically, I mean, we could go fishing. But what sort of tools are key in terms of implementing governance, and what can be the dangers? Who wants to take this one?
My turn to go first. I hope I will steal all your comments.
Yeah, he's good at that.
So regarding technical governance, of course, you have plenty of tools that have a direct impact on software quality, which I think was also one of the other questions we were considering here. But regarding political governance, I don't think you have much tools that will help. So sure, you have the basic tools for accountability. So having periodic reports requiring that every single action which is paid on foundation money is accompanied by a report is just a great idea. Having IRC logs where important technical decisions are made are very important and are basic accountability tools, but are nothing fancy. So it's something that we were using also outside foundations and that's outside the open source context. On the other hand, the technical tools we use to do development, for instance, Forges, GitHub, or specifically GitLog, are a great way to get insights on whether the governance of a project is good or not. For instance, there are more and more tools that companies in the foundation use to show where the technical contribution to a given project come from. So if you see that 80% of the technical contribution or 90% of the technical contribution to a given project come from a single company, even if on paper that project is governed by a very fair governance structure, they are not delivering on being a leveling playing field. If you see that contribution come from a wide variety of different companies or even different contributors paid by different entities or even volunteers, then you have a much better feeling on the fact that the governance of this project is probably doing something right.
So what you're saying is measuring the project, and I'm sure our CTO will be very interested in that measuring the project is something that can really help improve the governance.
So I don't know if it helps in improving it, but I think it's great in showing the current status of the governance and on actually what the governance of that project is actually delivering.
I think you've got to be very careful with that because so it's one of the good things that OpenStack has been doing is they've had Bitergia implementing a dashboard for them, giving statistics. And I think that's done a fine job in the OpenStack community of helping them to understand what their strengths and weaknesses are. So I think for your political governance, I think having an analytic dashboard is a very valuable thing. I think when it comes to your developer governance, it depends on how good your developer governance is as to whether you can automate it. So there's a lot of people who use GitHub as their repository, and GitHub imposes on you a governance, which is the pull request. I actually call it Git governance. You decide you're going to put your code into GitHub, and from then onwards, all collaboration is going to be asynchronous through an issues log and expressed through pull requests, unless you very actively and energetically do something different. And then there are points in that workflow where you can insert further governance tools. So there are plugins to check that people have made DCOs or signed contributor agreements. There are plugins to check that the project still builds after the pull request is integrated. So you can do those sorts of things. If your governance methodology is really complicated, you don't stand a chance of embodying it in a tool. If you have lots of human opinions that you need to gather, you might be able to create some workflow tool that will gather them. But fundamentally, a really complex governance, I don't think you can automate. So I'd say metrics for your political governance, and I would say that yes, if you've got an elegant technical governance, you can automate it.
And try to keep governance simple so as to avoid the rules that
with all of these
dark
things,
corners in the governance.
Elegance is your friend because elegant systems are hard to game.
So when all conflicts being resolved by consensus?
Consensus is a very powerful tool, but again, learn from Apache here. In Apache, to block consensus, you have to, but if you -1 in Apache, that is implicitly you saying that you're willing to solve the problem you've identified. And that's a strength and a weakness of Apache's governance. It means that no one will step in when it's really, really bad. But it means that in a fully committed project, people will only block when they're willing to correct.
Okay. So, Christian, when you hear this, as a user becoming increasingly a contributor into this big project or global project, what do you look for?
I think the number one factor of joining into these communities from a contributor perspective is the level playing field. To ensure that a community is not being driven by a single company or entity, as you've mentioned. So having some visibility on basic statistics, basic KPI, of course, is of interest. So level playing field and the ability to come in without major restrictions so that you can participate early, quickly, and without complexity. Very important, obviously.
Thank you very much. I think we have 5 minutes. I think we should put the logos of our sponsors on the screen, please, because this list of speakers is not right. It's been bothering me since the beginning, and I'm pretty sure everyone. So let's put our logos on the screen, please. The logo. Okay, we have a few minutes for questions from the audience, and I think I have a microphone here that can pass. Please introduce yourself and ask your question in English.
Okay, Gabriele Ruffatti, engineering group. Probably some people knows about me. Okay, I understand that quality governance is key for open source. I understand also that users is the most important role than developers, actually. And but we have three important guys from academia, an eclectic consultant, I can say, and from industry. And I want to ask you a very open question. So look at your glass bowl and tell me where open source is going now. Because it's going towards the great competitive projects like GenV, Hadoop, OpenStack. Is becoming irrelevant because of the rise of cloud services and software as a services, as Microsoft says, and many new applications says, or where is going open source?
But from an industry perspective, I would say that open source is becoming more and more prevalent. You mentioned Microsoft and their cloud offer. I don't know all the technologies underlying that, but I imagine some of them are open source. But more importantly around that, if you look at the different cloud solutions and services that now are available, most are platformed on open source technologies. So while from a user perspective, on an everyday desktop, you may not see the progression of open source that we all might imagine is wonderful. I think from a more hidden perspective on the infrastructure side, open source will clearly be increasingly present, and companies that don't take account of that dynamic will be left behind to a certain extent. So open source as a driver of innovation, as a supporter and a creator of standardization or interoperability, for example, I think will be a subject which becomes more and more present. If you look at European regulation, such as the DSM, we're looking at initiatives which are specifically centered around opening up the market. Now, open source is not obligatory, but it will be an enabler which will facilitate that kind of movement.
Thank you.
I'd say that you can't safely do cloud without open source. Anyone who tells you to use their cloud, and by the way, it's proprietary, has just asked you to permanently become their bond slave, because you'll be living in permanent license fee slavery to whichever company that is. I heard a company in San Francisco recently say they were going to become the dominant player in cloud along with Microsoft. And it's complete rubbish. You can't do open source you can't do cloud without open source. I think what's going to happen with open source is it's going to rapidly become something that is controlled and run by its users. We've gone through a phase where open source has been controlled by vendors in many cases, and I think we're increasingly seeing vendors avoid open source monetization models, and increasingly vendors are open sourcing their components. So look at what Facebook or Google does with open source, for example. Both of those companies run pretty much exclusively on open source software, and when they invent a new thing, they release it as a new open source project. And the reason they do that is because it increases the pace of innovation and reduces their maintenance costs. And I think we're all going to wake up to that sooner or later. We'll see fewer and fewer projects being run by vendors, more and more projects being run collaboratively. And finally, I don't think the desktop should be overlooked. I think we're going to see a shift within 5 years to a container desktop, where the platform provider is simply providing a surface for containers to run on. And in those containers, you'll be able to run any desktop software you want to, regardless of platform. And open source is clearly preferable for running in a container desktop. So I think we're going to see a change in the way desktop runs as well. The Linux desktop, the year of the Linux desktop is coming. You heard it here first.
So I think open source is winning, but software freedom is actually losing. So I agree with both other panelists that open source licensed software is something unavoidable in the industry. It's been for several years now, and I agree with Simon that we'll see more and more large project initiated by corporation or released under open source licenses. I think we're not delivering on actual software freedom for the final users. You cannot fork GitHub. You can fork a project which is on GitHub. You cannot fork Gmail, and so on and so forth. And you cannot install those things on your own servers. And that's more and more true also for very small devices. So the phone we use, smartphones, are more and more locked down devices in which, sure, you run a bunch of open source licensed software, but you really don't have the control of your device. So I think this is going to be soon a problem for industry as well, because if as Simon made a very convincing case about the fact that software freedom is actually very good for business. So I think companies are going to see that not being able to deploy on their own premises, very important infrastructure they rely on, is going to be a problem for them.
The whole crowdsourcing paradigm around open source is clearly a driver for innovation and for industry interest.
Thank you. Another question? No. I think does not inspire. Stefan?
Thank you. Simon and Stefano, you mentioned the importance of dashboards, if I understood correctly. So do you know of any dashboards for governance that would, for instance, capture the number of conflicts or transparency or untransparency that would exist? And would this make sense to develop this?
So as a pre-requirement for that, you need documentation of all those things. And I think in like decision-making bodies or this kind of stuff, right?
Or you could analyze the mailing lists and capture conflicts and see how it evolves and if people behave. It's complicated, but if we want clear transparency and accountability, as you said, we have to get metrics for governance as well.
Yeah. So one of the things about metrics is that first-order metrics are not usually useful. So measuring actual things is rarely useful because you can game things. But so most of the good dashboards I've seen measure derivative effects. So they measure either first or second derivatives. And so the way you detect conflict, for example, is perhaps with thread length on a mailing list. Where you find a hotspot with many very long threads, you're probably looking at something complex or either conflict or complexity. And as I have seen dashboards, so I've spoken with the guys from Bitergia a reasonable amount, and I have seen them implement derivatives that do things like look at thread length, look at contributor diversity, look at contributor frequency on mailing lists as a way of, and they don't say that finds conflict, but when you look at increased thread length and you discover that you have increased thread length with no contributor diversity, it's just two people and a long thread, that's a conflict. Mm-hmm. And so you can, by looking at derivatives, you can detect those things.
Okay, thank you. Another question? No. Okay, last chance for a last comment, each of you, before lunch.
Okay, so I'm going to speak up for copyleft licenses, because there's a natural instinct in communities, particularly business-driven communities, to fear copyleft. And we've seen the pendulum swing in the favor of non-reciprocal licenses, and I think that's a mistake, because I think that open source communities have an expectation of contribution. Even when they don't, even when it's not in the license, you find that most communities are irritated when people only take and never give. And I think that every open source community that I've seen expects contribution from its community participants. And if the license is the constitution of the community, then the license should say contribution is anticipated, either in the form of the Mozilla Public License, where you say contribution to our work is anticipated, but contribution of your work is not required, or indeed with the GPL, that you shouldn't fear the GPL. The GPL doesn't require you to make all your code public. It merely requires you to offer your source code to the recipients of your binaries. And it isn't anywhere near as scary as people who hate it might want you to believe. So consider copyleft. Not all copyleft licenses are dangerous.
Picking back onto that, I would say that this is particularly important for technological foundations. So foundation not in the sense of organization, but in the sense of the technical bricks you build your final product onto. So for instance, just naming a few random examples, stack technologies, compilers are all where you have a lot of companies contributing, would be great chances to use copyleft license and guaranteeing the level playing field that has been named multiple times on this stage.
I'm not a legal expert, so
Neither am I.
I think there's a risk that you have to balance the understanding of contribution with the certain tendency of companies to look at their IP protection. So that's a balance, how you draw the frontier between more freedoms, more protection. I think it's a case-by-case basis. But just saying, copyleft licenses are great, let's do more of them, is maybe a nice ideal. Is it realistic in today's environment? Yeah.
That would be the final word of this panel. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists, Christian Patterson, Simon Phipps, and Stefano Zaccherardi.